All right. Well, so to pick up more or less where we left off, I was going to start talking about printing. Well, printing, it's just one of many examples, though, of this strange disconnect between technology, where it is invented, and where it actually tends to be best used or exploited. I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture that we basically know both gunpowder and the printing press, or at least movable type, to have been first invented in China. However, they didn't really do all that much to change Chinese society or traditions. Now, China, to some extent, was always a less martial empire than its neighbor Japan, for example. The Japanese have always been famous as warriors, the samurai, of course, being one of the great global exemplars of a warrior caste and class that guards its traditions over the centuries. The Chinese, in part, I think, because of the geography of their own empire, although they were always vulnerable to invasion, they had one sort of secret weapon in reserve, which was that because they were the center of the world, and because everything worth having was in China, those who conquered China tended to assimilate into Chinese culture and not the other way around. So that the various waves of nomadic invasions from the north, ultimately, they were just kind of assimilated. You know, the Manchu dynasty being the most famous example of this, where a dynasty is created by outsiders, but is basically Chinese. That said, the Chinese, for whatever reason, they had this culture of centralized bureaucracy, the Mandarin culture, with these centralized exams, where the state really did control the economy. The state also essentially controlled society. So that the state kept a monopoly on printing. A monopoly, that is, the state controlled it. Only the state would allow books, or the early modern equivalent of books, to be printed. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how important that is, because whether or not a government controls printing, these days, I suppose, we all talk about the internet, something of a cliche that the internet has made censorship obsolete. It hasn't done so at all. A lot of countries censor the internet. China, of course, being one of the current examples of this. Government that controls access. I mean, here in Turkey, I think, what is it, YouTube that is censored, right? It's not impossible. It's certainly harder than it used to be for the government to control the flow of information. It's definitely harder than it used to be, but it's not impossible. That said, it was much, much easier in an era when you only had several printing presses and where the technology was itself a closely guarded secret. It was pretty easy to control. The knowledge itself, I mean, you think of how long it took the knowledge of the printing press to disseminate across Eurasia from China to Europe. It took hundreds of years. And even then, it took a little bit longer for the technology to be adapted. That said, it is curious, again, that this is one of those inventions which starts in East Asia, but comes to fruition in Europe. The same thing was even true, you might say, to a certain extent with mathematics. We call the modern numeric system, of course, we call them Arabic numerals. Although the basic understanding is that they were actually invented in India, but the Arabs kind of both perfected them and then also disseminated the technology to Europe. And so the Europeans started calling them Arabic numerals, and then that's what we still call them mostly today. A technology, again, invented in India, adapted kind of in the Islamic world, but then to a certain extent brought to its final fruition, at least in terms of modern science and the invention of the calculus in Europe. Rather curious. Gunpowder, another very good example. Now, gunpowder is a little bit less dramatic if you look at its differential introduction across the Eurasian continental expanse. It was certainly used in China. It was certainly used in Japan. It was definitely used in India, again then ruled by the Islamic Mughal Empire. It was definitely used in the Islamic Empire. I mean, quite famously in the conquest of Constantinople by Fatih Mehmet, they had these great cannon that knocked down the walls of Theodosius. So gunpowder was used in a lot of different places. But it wasn't used in the same way. The Europeans said, well, that's great. You can build these humongous cannons that it takes 700 people and a bunch of mules and oxen to transport. And that's all well and good. But that's not really all that practical on a daily basis. So why don't we try to maybe make the cannon out of bronze? Why don't we try to make it lighter? Why don't we try to make it more efficient? Why don't we try to put wheels on the carriage so you can actually begin carting it around, so that you can then have an army just as mobile as, let's say, horse-mounted warriors from the steppes, but of course 1,000 times more destructive because of the power of gunpowder, which has an exponential impact in terms of its explosive force over more ancient, primitive kinds of missiles. And somehow this happens in Europe. The Europeans perfect this really by about the 1490s, though it keeps getting better and better. Famously, it's usually said that it was when the French army invaded Italy and, essentially subdued all of those great city-states simply because they had the first mobile cannon. Of course, the French had a monopoly on this for a couple of years, and then everyone else figured out how to do it too. And then other Europeans came up with better versions of the cannon. Eventually, the Europeans, of course, figured out how to mount cannon on warships, particularly those long ocean-going galleons, the ships which to some extent were adapted from the great barges which plied the Baltic Sea in the great days of the Hanseatic League, which were sturdier than the kinds of ships they used in the Mediterranean. Some of this, again, is an accident of geography. Because Europe bordered the Atlantic Ocean, Europe had a need for vessels that could carry larger cargo, that could handle the kind of rough seas better, that were bigger, that were sturdier. And so they adapted the sailing ship. They figured out how to harness the winds. They figured out the winds, which could take them in one part of the year to Europe, and the other part of the year to Africa, the prevailing winds. And they figured out in these huge ships, they were strong enough that they could handle the recoil produced by cannon. Particularly once the cannon were improved, made to be smaller, they figured out it was better to put it basically on the sides of the ships as opposed to fore and aft, because the recoil would do less damage there. That's why if you see that movie Master and Commander, I mean, you can see that even though these ships are strong and sturdy, and even though the cannon are much smaller, it still produces tremendous recoil. Suddenly you have a ship that can travel halfway around the world and do battle. Kind of the early modern equivalent, you might say, of the modern aircraft carrier, which allows a sophisticated air force to operate anywhere in the world. An advantage, of course, that the Americans have had a virtual monopoly on, really, at least for the past 20 or 30 years. A monopoly which is probably going to be fast eroding. You have striking power and you have range that you didn't have before. Now here again we have one of those really curious things. Just like with the printing revolution in China, which never happened, the ocean-going vessel, what we might call the potential globalization of the world through ocean-going commerce and gunboat diplomacy, as it's usually called. Gunboat diplomacy means basically you point your guns at somebody and you say, trade with us or else. And that's what the Europeans would often do. That's what the Americans famously did in Japan in 1853, Commodore Perry. What's interesting about this, though, is, again, the Europeans didn't really invent the technology. The Chinese, I mentioned this Cheng Ho mission, usually dated to around 1430. There's actually a whole fascinating new trend in scholarship to look at the possibility that the Chinese actually discovered America before Columbus did. To which one retort is, so what? The Vikings discovered America even before that. And, who really cares who discovered it first, right? What matters is who settled it and turned it into a kind of going concern in the global economy. The Chinese might well have discovered America, and there might even have been an early settlement that was somehow later washed away such that there isn't a great archaeological record of it. They definitely had the capacity to discover America. They had ocean-going vessels, which were just as large as the later Portuguese galleons, which plied the Atlantic and circumnavigated Africa and opened up Asian trade. But then a funny thing happened. The government banned them. It essentially banned overseas trade. Why? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know what they were thinking. Deciding, we're the most advanced empire in the world with essentially the greatest technology and a head start on everyone else. Let's shoot ourselves in the foot by banning further developments in this area, by closing ourselves off from the world and not developing the technology in which we are the pioneers and the leaders. It's kind of curious. Amazingly, the same thing happens in Japan, but in an even more dramatic way. In Japan, they knew all about gunpowder, just like they did in China. They had, to a certain extent, some seagoing vessels which could have traded. They did the same thing the Chinese did a little bit later. It was in the early 70s. I wrote it up here. They abandoned the construction of They banned the construction of ocean-going ships. Essentially, they banned overseas trade. And then, even more dramatically, they literally banned the use of the gun. They do not allow anyone to own, much less use, guns. Now, Japan, partly being a much more homogeneous, again, an island society, a little bit like England, it's a little bit easier to enforce these kinds of rules than it would be across a great continental expanse like China or Eurasia. But they actually succeeded in getting rid of the gun for over 200 years and closing themselves off to the world entirely. The Europeans would send these trade missions, and if they made it to Japan, they would just be killed because they did not want influence. They did not want anything to disturb their traditional culture. Now, at least here, I think more than with the Chinese, I can kind of understand the argument. And it's an argument which might have relevance for a lot of peoples in the modern world who might have been better off if, let's say, they had not allowed themselves to have Western influence come down upon their countries. I mean, this is, after all, the dilemma of almost every power in the last 200 years. How do you preserve your traditional way of life? If you want to, that is, against European encroachment. Well, the Japanese had a very extreme answer to that. That was kill any Europeans who set foot on your soil, ban the use of this, as they called it, a foreign technology, even though it really came from China, the gun, that is. Preserve the samurai warrior culture. Which, after all, is a lot more grand and glorious than the gun. I mean, if you really think about what the gun does, what it does to warfare, but even more, to a certain extent, what it does to social structure and hierarchy. When you think about your Spahi cavalryman in the Ottoman Empire, your elite mounted warrior, the knight, let's say, in medieval Europe. Even to a certain extent, your horse-mounted nomad, the Turks and Mongols who would come down from Central Asia. They were elite. They were elite in part because of their technique. I mean, it was not an easy thing, to ride a horse and fire a composite bow at the same time. You had to balance yourself as you were doing this. I mean, there are all kinds of legends about, what Turks and Mongols could do on horseback. It was just extremely difficult to learn. Actually, the Byzantines studied this, and they tried to ape the same techniques. And they found that it took years and years of training. It was almost impossible. Now, there were certain vulnerabilities. The problem with the composite bow, by the way, it actually was deadlier than the European longbow. But because it was made essentially of a kind of composite of animal intestines and insides, it was vulnerable particularly to the rain, so that you always had to keep them hidden. They weren't necessarily that easy to preserve. They were also extremely expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. That was another thing about European weapons. They didn't always tend to be really the best necessarily, but they were the easiest to mass produce. But anyway, so back to Japan. Back to the samurai warrior culture. Some of you might have seen the recent Tom Cruise movie, I assume, The Last Samurai. Yeah, well, they obviously over-dramatized and simplified it to make a point. But the point was true. This actually happened after the Americans opened up Japan. I mean, literally opened it up with gunboat diplomacy, with this mission of these gunboats, basically, saying, trade with us or else, we are going to bomb you. Because we want to trade with you. Not because we want to kill you, because we want to trade with you. But if we have to, we will use our gunboats. This was in 1853, so it was over 200 years since they had literally banned the gun. I mean, Japanese warrior culture, Japanese society had essentially then become almost frozen in time. It's not that it didn't change at all. But they resisted the encroachment of the modern world for over 200 years, very successfully. And then suddenly, poof, you introduce the gun, and all hell breaks loose, basically. Because you think about it. To learn the tradition of the samurai warrior, It's partly something you're born into, but then you also have to be trained from a very early age. This has often been true of warrior cultures. I mean, ancient Sparta, famously, they would take their boys away from their families and train them in the arts of warfare and set them off on their own and so on and so forth. Warrior cultures are often like this. There's a lot of pride that comes with this because you're mastering these techniques. There's also an exclusivity about it because only certain elite people can master these techniques. The Europeans had their own version of this with the famous, mailed knights. If you had horseback and you had all of this armor, it was all very expensive too, And so just like the swords that the samurais used were very expensive, and you had to learn how to use them properly. And now suddenly someone comes along with a gun, and anyone can learn how to use a gun in about, 5 minutes really. I mean, maybe everyone is not going to become an equally adept marksman, but it's not that hard to figure out how to pick up a gun and fire it. Boom! You're dead. Just like that. I mean, The Last Samurai kind of explained, there it's the Maxim gun, it's actually the machine gun, which finally defeats the samurai. I think there's a better movie for illustrating the dramatic and democratic nature of the gun. The fact that it overturns and obliterates all these traditions. I assume many of you have seen the Indiana Jones movies. Yeah. You know the original one. Not Temple of Doom, what was the original one called? Indiana Jones. The Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The first one, where they start off in Asia and then they end up in Egypt, right? And so he's in Egypt. He's going through Cairo. He's getting in fights because, he's Indiana Jones, and, so he fights everyone. And he's kind of a little tired of having to kick everyone's butt. So he finally comes to this great square. He's chasing after, what's her name? Karen Allen is the actress. I can't remember the character's name. He's chasing after her, and this great warrior, presumably he's sort of like this modern incarnation of the great Mamluk warriors of, Egypt's glorified past. He comes out and he's got his flowing turban and he's got his swords and he's doing all of these tricks with his swords and he's basically showing off, before the assembled crowds, all of his prowess and his skill as an individual warrior, the kind of heroic warrior of yore. And what does Indiana Jones do? He just pulls out a gun and shoots him. And everyone laughs because it's funny. It is funny, but it's also in a way not funny, right? Because you think about what has happened to this kind of heroic ancient tradition faced with this modern invention which obliterates all distinctions, right? Any man can now be a warrior. It's radically democratic. Now, this is why, if you want to understand certain aspects of modern America, you have to actually look at the whole nature of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, which has to do with, as it's usually called, the right to bear arms. Now, if you read the wording of it, it's a little more specific. It has to do with militias. But the basic idea is that individual citizens, or at the least, groups of individual citizens banded together as militia, have a right to bear arms which cannot be taken away. Now, Americans who tend to be fanatics about this sort of thing, they'll always tell you that any despotism, any tyrannical empire, any dictatorship, the first thing they will do is disarm the people. And so they'll go to a place like, let's say, Nazi Germany, and they'll say, well, look, this is what the Nazis did. They disarmed their opponents, and eventually they controlled everyone. Now, it's an oversimplification, not least of Nazi history, which really wasn't quite like that. But there's still a certain point there. Citizens who bear arms are free. Now, this is not necessarily a new thing in the modern age of democracy, or whatever we want to call Republican rule. This was certainly true in, shall we say, medieval Europe to a certain extent. The knights who bore arms. They were something like the equivalent of modern citizens. It was true in ancient Rome, where if you were a citizen of Rome, that meant you had certain legal protections and rights. The right to bear arms was not necessarily crucial, but usually a citizen of Rome would have had at least some military experience. Slaves obviously did not have the right to bear arms. You could even say to a certain extent the history of Islam has an analog, which is to say Islam being a fighting faith, Muslims have essentially been the warrior class. You look at most of the places which were incorporated into Islam in the days of the conquest. I mean, remember when Islam spread, you could say it spread by the sword, to a certain extent, that you could also say it spread by persuasion, because a lot of people converted. But on the other hand, it didn't really ever spread universally, did it? Not everyone converted. Why would people not convert to Islam? Or why, to put the question a different way, did the Islamic conquerors not want everyone to convert? I mean, the Ottoman Empire, at times, its population was usually majority Muslim, at least in the last 200 or 300 years. Not in the early days, though. What about all of the lands originally conquered by Islam? You know, lands like Syria, Egypt, Palestine. And the populations there that were not Muslim, I mean, what was their faith? There were, you know, several, but you had Christians, right? You had Jews. You had certain pagans. You had Zoroastrians, maybe. Did everyone become Muslim right away? No. So why would the Muslims not necessarily want everyone to become Muslim?
Because they collect taxes.
They collect taxes, right. Also, they don't bear arms, right? It's a very fundamental... Sorry? Trading, sure, yes. You also have, obviously, the millet system, actually, is usually called. I think I did write this on the board. The millet system, which, you know, at the time was kind of commonsensical. You let the different groups govern their own affairs. The Jews more or less look after the Jews, the Christians look after the Christians, and so on and so forth. They have their own laws, they have their own traditions, they have their own ceremonies. And so long as they don't disturb the Muslims or commit a crime against a Muslim, or, you know, a crime which is specific to the Sharia law, then they govern themselves. It's interesting, some scholars have posited that the ideal demographic breakdown of an Islamic state was actually only 30% Muslim. You think about why. Well, the Muslims aren't paying taxes, right? So you need somebody to pay the taxes to fund, essentially, the army. You know, and for the most part in the early modern era, that is basically what you spent most of your money on. You didn't have these like modern welfare systems with, you know, pension benefits and so on. If you're talking about public expenditure, you're talking about the army. It's an advantage, actually, that the Ottomans had over the Europeans, at least, let's say, in like the 14th and 15th century. They did have a fairly effective tax system. Later on, of course, famously, it kind of runs into decrepitude. But then again, maybe part of the reason it kind of ran into decrepitude is because more and more people converted to Islam. You have the jizya tax, famously, right? This is the tax paid by the people of the book, the infidels, the non-Muslims. So to a certain extent, this is peculiar to Islam, but in another sense, it's really not that different from what I was talking about a minute ago, right? The citizens. You have citizens and non-citizens, right? I mean, in ancient Rome, you had a republic, you had voting, but obviously not everyone was voting, right? I mean, the women weren't voting, the slaves weren't voting, foreigners weren't voting. You had to be a citizen to vote. Because one of the odder things about modern democracy is the notion that everyone votes. I mean, these days everyone considers that to be a kind of fundamental right, and how could it be otherwise? But that's not the way it has usually been in most times and places. Usually you have some kind of elite, whether you call them citizens, those who bear arms, those with the right to vote. And you can see then a certain analog in the Islamic tradition to the Roman tradition. There are other things, though, which were dramatically different. I'm just going to close the door here. The Europeans did not have anything quite like the millet system. Millet these days, I guess, we think of as just nationality or national. Well, millet would be nationalism, I guess. Yes, millet. It meant something a little different in the early modern era. It meant something a little bit like self-government. You know, it meant you had different groups running their own affairs, and you had an analog to this. This is actually a curious fact. I'm sure you've all heard about the. I think you call them capitulation, right? The capitulations. These become a great thorn in the side of, you know, the Ottomans, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, and the kind of the era of real European ascendance, where the Europeans start interfering in Ottoman affairs. Do you know when the first capitulation was given? To France. Do you know the year?
1535.
Yeah, I've heard 1534, but that's about right. We'll call it like 1534, 1535. So remember, this is in the classical era, right? I mean, this is Süleyman Kanuni's time, right? The Ottomans have just won this great battle of Mohacs, 1526, right? They are threatening Vienna. That's Mohacs. And then 1529 is the first siege of Vienna. There's another sort of abortive effort to seize Vienna several years later. These are the glory days, right? This is when the Ottoman Empire is in its sort of heyday, its height of power and prestige, right? When I was talking about the gifts piling up, you know, in Topkapi Palace. And yet they are issuing a capitulation to the French, which includes a certain trading privilege, but also, interestingly, I think I did write the word up here somewhere or other, extraterritoriality. A little bit like the Millets. They're supposed to police themselves and govern themselves. You could call it the kind of first step on a kind of slippery slope, as we call it in English, right? You give these privileges to more and more people, and ultimately you begin to lose control a little bit, right? The French, or the Italians, well, different Italians, the Genoese, the Venetians, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Jews, they tend then to take over certain sectors of trade. I mean, the Armenians are in all kinds of facets of trade, you know, and also working as kind of artisans and skilled craftsmen and so on. You know, the Greeks are handling most of the kind of ocean-going trade. Yeah, the Italians, the Europeans are doing a lot of the trading in the big ports. Obviously, banking, to the extent that it exists, is largely a matter of infidels. But the closer you look at the Ottoman Empire, actually, the stranger it does begin to look in terms of this whole notion of status. I mean, Muslims have the status, right? They bear the arms. It is, to a very literal extent, an Islamic power and Islamic empire. But who actually governs the Ottoman Empire? I mean, the Janissaries, for the most part, are converted Christians, at least in the early days. You have the Kul, right? The Devshirme. Again, these are Christians. Yes, they convert to Islam. They're all born Christian. And they are, to a certain extent, slaves of the Sultan. I mean, even most of the Grand Viziers are technically, in a legal sense, slaves. It's a very interesting system. I mean, like, the more I learn about it, the more fascinated by it I am. Because it is so different from what you had in Europe at the time. And for a very long time, the Europeans, too, were fascinated by it, and they tried to learn from it. I mean, in fact, if you look at this era, there's so many books being written about the Turks and the Ottomans by Europeans. You might have heard that phrase, terrible Turk. Yes, after a certain time, this became a little bit of a cliche, you know, this kind of anti-Turkish prejudice. But that wasn't the way it was in the early days. Europeans actually were fascinated by the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to travel there. They wanted to go there. They wanted to learn about it. They saw it as successful. And actually, there were certain things about it that did work very well. If you looked at, let's say, the system of the harem, or even to a certain extent, the system of fratricide, that is to say, the putting to death of the brothers by the Sultan, it actually seemed to produce, at least up through, let's say, Süleyman Kanuni, it seemed to produce a line of exceptionally able and competent sultans. There was almost a kind of meritocracy to it, right? You had talent rising through the system. You know, whether it was the most ambitious of the Kul, whether it was the Janissaries who could be very low-born, you know, whether it was the palace officials at the Babi Ali, many of whom had come from very humble origins, or the sultans themselves, who always had to survive a kind of brutal, sudden succession struggle, who had to secure the loyalty of the troops. One of the reasons this so fascinated Europeans is that they had something very different. I think the best way of summarizing it quickly would be talking about this institution of primogeniture. I know there is a Turkish word, ezberiyet, I think. Does that sound right? Inheritance. Is it ezberiyet? No, ekberiyet. Ekberiyet. It's not exactly identical, but I think it has something of the same principle. Ekberiyet? Edberiyet. What it means literally is succession that is to the eldest son. the inheritance from father to the eldest son. Only the oldest son, but a direct line of title, of property, and also of whatever obligations in terms of feudalism, that is, that the peasants might have owed to their lord. In Europe, in other words, it meant a lot what your name was. It mattered a lot who you were born, that is, who your parents were. You had a very grand and, to a certain extent, very obnoxious aristocracy. I mean, it really it reached its apogee, I suppose, in the days before the First World War, when the Lord Marquess of Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, he could trace his ancestry back through, I think, something like 60 generations, right? You know, way back to the 11th century, you know, going back like 1,000 years. And this would encompass all kinds of things. You know, you would have land, and you would have wealth, and you would have title. You would have all kinds of obligations that your social inferiors would have towards you. I mean, you could see even fascinating versions of this in a sort of popular literature. If you've seen or read Pride and Prejudice, it's probably something more interesting to the women than the men. But how many have read Pride and Prejudice or seen one of the movies? Right, so you know all of this thing about the importance of the name and the estate. But also you think about these great estates, all the chateaus and castles in Europe. There was no real equivalent in Ottoman lands. You had status, to be sure, but the status was kind of in the here and now. You know, if you were a Spahi cavalryman warrior, you would get a timar, right? It would be kind of like something like the European feudal system, where you could collect taxes from the rea, you know, from the peasants. But it was on loan from the Sultan. It would last for as long as the Sultan lived, or as long as you lived, but not longer. You know, the great Ottoman army would set out almost every year. You know, usually for Europe, sometimes towards Persia. New lands, new conquests, new titles. A lot of new blood all the time. But on the other hand, you couldn't really pass it on from father to son. You couldn't pass on these titles. You know, the Grand Vizier was not an office which descended based on inheritance. It was more of a meritocracy. Again, I said this is why a lot of Europeans really admired the Ottoman system. They wanted to learn from it. They were fascinated by it. And okay, yes, some of it was kind of the raunchy stuff about the harem and all these, you know, tales of life in the harem and lots of kind of gossipy stuff about what it was really like inside the Sultan's palace in Topkapi. They were fascinated by the Ottoman Empire. In a way that, interestingly, I don't think the Ottomans ever really were by Europe, at least until much, much later. Now, you have books written by Europeans dating to this classical era. I mean, it's kind of curious in a way. The Ottomans have the power and the prestige. But on that, it's really the Europeans who are writing the books about the Ottomans. Even the paintings of the sultans, you know, many of which you can see in, you know, in the museums. Museum in Topkapi, for example. You know, they tended to be painted by Europeans, not least because, of course, the traditional prescription, you know, in Islamic law towards pictorial representation, you know, which has not always been universally enforced, but is still a pretty firm rule in most Islamic countries. So the Europeans themselves were fascinated by the Ottomans. They're painting them, they're writing about them. And there's something to be said for that, a kind of curiosity. So back to printing. Here's another fascinating example. Remember that in China, you know, they invent it, but then it's retained by the government. It's a monopoly. Europe, the printing press famously is introduced by Johannes Gutenberg. The date usually given, it's about 1452, although there's a lot of dispute about the exact, I had it over here. Right. The key fact is not when it was invented or introduced. The key fact is how quickly it spreads and disseminates. Within about 30 years, in what is now modern Germany, of course Germany didn't exist then, but roughly the territory of modern Germany, you had over 100 printing presses. The number 110 is usually given. I don't know if that's exact. But here's the thing, no one controlled them. You know, several of them, yes, were controlled by, you know, the odd prince or bishop who had a certain agenda. But there was no centralized control. They printed what they wanted. Now, so what do they print mostly? Anyone want to guess? Bibles. Yeah. There was some lurid stuff too. I think pornography probably would have been the second biggest category. Not as explicit as the modern version, but I mean, you know, kind of salacious stuff. But yeah, the Bible. I mean, that's the main thing. In fact, you cannot understand the Reformation, that's really more next week's subject when we look at the religious wars and the 30 Years' War and the rise of the state system. That's really the biggest thing you need to understand if you want to understand the Reformation. Where does it come from? Where does this kind of spirit of religious dissent come from? It comes from the printing press, because suddenly everyone can read the Bible. I mean, if you look at the great churches and monasteries of Europe, the famous stained glass that you'll see in a cathedral like in Chartres in France or Notre Dame. The reason they had that stained glass was, of course, to tell the stories from the Bible, because, of course, most peasants couldn't read or write. Well, literacy was still spreading slowly, but the introduction of the printing press helps, not least because, of course, print is much easier on the eyes, it's easier to read than ancient manuscripts. And also it's cheaper, and it's much more easily disseminated. Now, you didn't have to necessarily read to get in on the game, because if you went to a tavern or if you went to a village meeting and someone else knew how to read, well, they could share it with you. And suddenly everyone is talking about religion and debating the real, true meaning of the Bible. This is where you get Martin Luther's his phrase, the priesthood of all believers, the idea that every man can read the Bible and make up his own mind about it. And this begins to break down all kinds of distinctions. Now, it's true some of it was accidental, and we'll look at this next week, had the wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs turned out a little differently, they might have been able to suppress the whole Protestant rebellion and nip the thing in the bud. But the fact is they didn't. In fact, the thing spreads even further. By about 1500, you have 20 million books in circulation in Europe alone. 20 million books. This isn't just less than 5 decades after the introduction of the printing press. You had nothing like that in China, nothing like it in Japan, and definitely nothing like it in the Ottoman Empire, where books are introduced extremely slowly, and even then usually for kind of technical subjects. Yes, of course, for religion as well, Quran, but not really for general, wide-ranging, free-ranging discussions of things like political affairs and interpretation. You didn't have this kind of argument. Now again, as with all of these things, there's both good and bad, what the Europeans are going through. This kind of new, vigorous argument, of course, leads to these colossal wars, usually called the religious wars, which last, depending on how you count, a century and a half. It's not really a very nice time to be living through in some ways, particularly if you happen to lose your home, or you're killed on the battlefield, or you lose a loved one. On the other hand, these wars, and this is kind of this pseudo-modern argument about the progressive nature of warfare. They're progressive in part because the Europeans keep improving their armaments and so on, but also because, to a certain extent, they eventually learn something from them. Now, what do they learn? I mean, yeah, you can simplify and say eventually Europeans learned to stop killing each other over religion. Yeah, maybe. You could also say, though, that they learned to set religion aside separately. I mean, there are different arguments about this, too. This concept of a separation between church and state, which you sometimes hear, is something that does distinguish the modern West from, whether it is a Confucian bureaucracy in China or in Islam, where the caliph was, of course, I mean, this is the thing, the notion of the Pope and the emperor as being separate, whereas, of course, in Islam, the caliph is kind of both in one, right? You're the spiritual head, but you're also the temporal, the political chief of the country. There's no distinction between, as supposedly Christ said, render unto Caesar. Caesar and Christ being different, religion and state being different. You could obviously over-exaggerate this point, too. There have been times in European history where the emperors have very much tried to interfere in religious affairs. Some people date the schism back to the 11th century and the Canossa incident of 1076. Some people say it's not until the end of the religious wars. Some people point to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 with this principle in Latin, quis regio ius religio, literally means he who rules shall decide. Now, this is nothing like our modern notion of the freedom of religion, freedom of expression. All it said was that different states could have different religions, and the rulers of those states could decide which religion they would have. It was still a revolutionary development, though, in at least this sense. There was a certain break between the notion of whatever a state was and whatever, let's say, God's region on earth was. The authority of the state did not come from God, did not come from some universal notion. It came from other states. Now again, simple as this might sound to us today, it was a revolutionary idea. It's really the foundation of the modern state system. The idea of the United Nations, for example, of sovereignty. These states do not derive their authority from God or from anyone's God. They derive it from whom? From other states. It's a kind of radical idea when you really think about it. Right, you go from being God's region on earth, or Burgrave of the world, or Lord of the horizons, or the celestial cynosure of people's eyes, as in China, to a whole bunch of states, none of which are necessarily any better than others, that recognize each other. And they recognize each other just because they recognize each other. I mean, it's like any state can decide that other states want to recognize it. When the United Nations adds a new state, that's because other states have agreed to recognize that new state. It's not for any other reason. So that, too, is a kind of revolution, I think, in political affairs, at least in geopolitical affairs in Europe. Now, for all of these reasons, Europe did start to pull away. You can look at something like science, armaments, military affairs. That's all important, too. But I think that underlying all of it was a certain dynamism made possible by all of the rest of this stuff. Again, you might not have necessarily guessed this. Like if you looked at the Ottoman system, you'd say, oh, well, there are a lot of advantages here. You know, look, this millet stuff, look, that makes a lot of sense. You know, you let the religious minorities govern their own affairs. You compare that to the European system of the time, and it actually is far more attractive. I mean, the European system was, you have Christianity, and to a certain extent you tolerate Jews, just barely. And then you extirpate heretics, right? You know, pagans. Famously, you know, there's this craze against the witches. You know, the Salem witch hunt, even in America, you know, in the 17th century. You know, so you are trying to impose some vision of Christianity. You're not tolerating minority groups and allowing them to run their own affairs. It seems like, in a lot of ways, the Millet system would function better. You know, would allow for more specialized, shall we say, division of labor. On the other hand, you think about the very modern notion of equality before the law and the rule of law. It doesn't accord with the Millet system, does it? If everyone has separate rules, everyone is not obeying the same laws. That's a disadvantage. You can't run the state in an effective way if everyone is not obeying the same laws. Probably for trade, it might be a disadvantage too. Now, in the short run, it might be advantageous to have different groups specialize. But to have it ossify so that only those groups can do those things, I think doesn't work. You know, so again, for all of these reasons, it's not by any means a case of one civilization being, quote unquote, better than another. But I think if you want to get to grips with essentially the basic fact of modern history, you know, which is the rise of Europe to prominence in world affairs, it helps to understand all of this. Now again, whether other cultures decide to emulate the West, whether they decide to resist the West, to do the extreme version of what the Japanese did and just cut it off, that's very difficult to do, of course. Or whether you try to accept certain elements and not other elements. It's kind of what the Ottomans eventually did. You know, by the later 18th century, you know, once they're really losing ground and they're starting to lose wars, they decide they want to start importing European military advisors, right? You know, so you bring in someone like a Moltke the Elder, the famous Prussian general. Before that, there were a bunch of Frenchmen, you know, who would come in. Even Napoleon. Napoleon actually considered and then turned down a commission in the Ottoman army. It was something a lot of European officers did at the time. You know, it was kind of a way of advancing your career. Also a way of, you know, learning about a new country. But there were always certain limitations, right? The Ottomans wanted to learn about the European military advantage. Maybe they wanted to learn about certain advantages in science and medicine. But they certainly didn't want to learn about European ideas of politics. They certainly didn't want to learn about European ideas of, you know, religion or ways of ordering minority affairs. There were always limits. A little bit like what the Japanese and the Chinese eventually did, although the Japanese did it much more successfully than the Chinese did. You know, when they decided to adapt Western military technology and in many cases improve upon it, while still trying to maintain their traditional culture. It's a difficult circle to square. And most peoples have actually, I think, failed to do so. But the dilemma is very interesting, as is the basic question. Because, again, this circumnavigation of the world circa 1500, if you were visiting from outer space and visiting all of these different countries, you probably wouldn't have guessed that the Europeans would have ended up playing the dominant role. But they did. The modern world, for better or for ill, has been made by the Europeans, by the Western Europeans, and I suppose more recently, of course, by the Americans, but essentially the descendants of Western Europeans. And so it's important to understand how things got that way, why it is that we have a modern state system that functions the way it does, why we even have a United Nations, what the idea of the United Nations is. These are all Western ideas, which, again, may not last. It may be true that right now the world is reverting back to an earlier state, with China in a much more prominent and central role. It could be that, as everyone is saying, America's days of hegemony are kind of waning. Europe, as we all know, has kind of lost its vigor and its energy. So that there may well be a revival of other parts of the world. And maybe the European model will lose its relevance. But I think it's a little bit premature to declare that. How are we doing on time? 4 minutes left. Well, that's mostly what I wanted to cover today. Now, since most of you haven't done the reading yet, I want you to think of all of this as you are doing the reading and to come to class with questions on Friday. Comments, obviously. Again, the different arguments, I've laid out some of them today. The Jared-Diamond argument, that's kind of one of the more influential these days. Victor Hansen, just so you have a little bit of background, to generalize roughly, Diamond comes a bit more from the left and Victor Hansen comes a bit more from the right. He's kind of what they call, I suppose he might be called a neocon. I mean, he might resist the label, but that's the way people might regard him. Which is to say that he's a conservative, but who has certain progressive notions and certain taboos that he too obeys. Paul Kennedy is more middle of the road. I mean, he's not. The thing that's interesting about him is he's not really trying to make any really big controversial claims. He's just trying to understand the world as it is. So I think it's good to see different ways of looking at the same question. And Paul Kennedy's book has a lot of really good information too. I mean, just really good raw data on things like trade and technology and statistics, armaments, expenditures, all that kind of thing. So I hope you enjoy the reading. And please do come with questions so we can get a discussion going on Friday. Are there any questions now about the readings? Do you all know what you are to do? Okay. Good. The Chinese, for whatever reason, they had this culture of centralized bureaucracy, the Mandarin culture, with these centralized exams, where the state really did control the economy. The state also essentially controlled society. So that the state kept a monopoly on printing. A monopoly, that is, the state controlled it. Only the state would allow books, or the early modern equivalent of books, to be printed. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how important that is, because whether or not a government controls printing, these days I suppose we all talk about the internet, something of a cliche that the internet has made censorship obsolete. It hasn't done so at all. A lot of countries censor the internet. China, of course, being one of the current examples of this. Government that controls access. I mean, here in Turkey, I think, what is it, YouTube that is censored, right? It's not impossible. It's certainly harder than it used to be for the government to control the flow of information. It's definitely harder than it used to be, but it's not impossible. That said, it was much, much easier in an era when you only had several printing presses and where the technology was itself a closely guarded secret. It was pretty easy to control. The knowledge itself, I mean, you think of how long it took the knowledge of the printing press to disseminate across Eurasia from China to Europe. It took hundreds of years. And even then, it took a little bit longer for the technology to be adapted. That said, it is curious, again, that this is one of those inventions which starts in East Asia, but comes to fruition in Europe. The same thing was even true, you might say, to a certain extent with mathematics. We call the modern numeric system the steps, but of course 1,000 times more destructive because of the power of gunpowder, which has an exponential impact in terms of its explosive force over more ancient, primitive kinds of missiles. And somehow this happens in Europe. The Europeans perfect this really by about the 1490s, though it keeps getting better and better. Famously, it's usually said that it was when the French army invaded Italy and essentially subdued all of those great city-states simply because they had the first mobile cannon. Of course, the French had a monopoly on this for a couple of years, and then everyone else figured out how to do it too. And then other Europeans came up with better versions of the cannon. Eventually, the Europeans, of course, figured out how to mount cannon on warships, particularly those long ocean-going galleons, the ships which to some extent were adapted from the great barges which plied the Baltic Sea in the great days of the Hanseatic League, which were sturdier than the kinds of ships they used in the Mediterranean. Some of this, again, is an accident of geography. Because Europe bordered the Atlantic Ocean, Europe had a need for vessels that could carry larger cargo, that could handle the kind of rough seas better, that were bigger, that were sturdier. And so they adapted the sailing ship. They figured out how to harness the winds. They figured out the winds, which could take them in one part of the year to Europe and the other part of the year to Africa, the prevailing winds. And they figured out in these huge ships, they were strong enough that they could handle the recoil produced by cannon. Particularly once the cannon were improved, made to be smaller, they figured out it was better to put it basically on the sides of the ships as opposed to fore and aft. All right. Well, so to pick up more or less where we left off, I was going to start talking about printing. Well, printing, it's just one of many examples, though, of this strange disconnect between technology, where it is invented, and where it actually tends to be best used or exploited. I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture that we basically know both gunpowder and the printing press, or at least movable type, to have been first invented in China. However, they didn't really do all that much to change Chinese society or traditions. Now, China, to some extent, was always a less martial empire than its neighbor Japan, for example. The Japanese have always been famous as warriors, the samurai, of course, being one of the great global exemplars of a warrior caste and class that guards its traditions over the centuries. The Chinese, in part, I think, because of the geography of their own empire, although they were always vulnerable to invasion, they had one sort of secret weapon in reserve, which was that because they were the center of the world, and because everything worth having was in China, those who conquered China tended to assimilate into Chinese culture and not the other way around. So that the various waves of nomadic invasions from the north, ultimately, they were just kind of assimilated. The Manchu dynasty being the most famous example of this, where a dynasty is created by outsiders, but is basically Chinese. That's, of course, we call them Arabic numerals. Although the basic understanding is that they were actually invented in India, but the Arabs kind of both perfected them and then also disseminated the technology to Europe. And so the Europeans started calling them Arabic numerals, and then that's what we still call them mostly today. A technology, again, invented in India, adapted kind of in the Islamic world, but then to a certain extent brought to its final fruition, at least in terms of modern science and the invention of the calculus in Europe. Rather curious. Gunpowder, another very good example. Now, gunpowder is a little bit less dramatic if you look at its differential introduction across the Eurasian continental expanse. It was certainly used in China. It was certainly used in Japan. It was definitely used in India, again then ruled by the Islamic Mughal Empire. It was definitely used in the Islamic Empire. I mean, quite famously in the conquest of Constantinople by Fatih Mehmet, they had these great cannon that knocked down the walls of Theodosius. So gunpowder was used in a lot of different places. But it wasn't used in the same way. The Europeans said, well, that's great. You can build these humongous cannons that it takes 700 people and a bunch of mules and oxen to transport. And that's all well and good. But that's not really all that practical on a daily basis. So why don't we try to maybe make the cannon out of bronze? Why don't we try to make it lighter? Why don't we try to make it more efficient? Why don't we try to put wheels on the carriage so you can actually begin carting it around, so that you can then have an army just as mobile as, let's say, horse-mounted warrior aft, because the recoil would do less damage there. That's why if you see that movie Master and Commander, I mean, you can see that, even though these ships are strong and sturdy, and even though the cannon are much smaller, it still produces tremendous recoil. Suddenly you have a ship that can travel halfway around the world and do battle. Kind of the early modern equivalent, you might say, of the modern aircraft carrier, which allows a sophisticated air force to operate anywhere in the world. An advantage, of course, that the Americans have had a virtual monopoly on, really, at least for the past 20 or 30 years. A monopoly which is probably going to be fast eroding. You have striking power and you have range that you didn't have before. Now here again we have one of those really curious things. Just like with the printing revolution in China, which never happened. The ocean-going vessel, what we might call the potential globalization of the world through ocean-going commerce and gunboat diplomacy, as it's usually called. Gunboat diplomacy means basically you point your guns at somebody and you say, trade with us or else. And that's what the Europeans would often do. That's what the Americans famously did in Japan in 1853, Commodore Perry. What's interesting about this, though, is, again, the Europeans didn't really invent the technology. The Chinese, I mentioned this Cheng Ho mission, usually dated to around 1430. There's actually a whole fascinating new trend in scholarship to look at the possibility that the Chinese actually discovered America before Columbus did. To which one retort is, so what? The Vikings discovered America even before that. And who really cares who discovered it first, right? What matters is who settled it and turned it into a kind